There are valleys in Spain where the earth does not yield wheat but secrets, and where a family name is spoken only in whispers, long after the house has fallen to ruin. What survives are fragments, brittle paper, fading photographs, and the testimonies of neighbors who swore they saw shadows moving long after the doors were nailed shut. In such fragments, we find the story of the Serrano sisters and of the man they all called husband. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year was 1834, and the mountain valley near Asturias in northern Spain was largely cut off from the rest of the world. The villages scattered along the ridges traded little with outsiders, depending instead on their own harvests of maize, sheep, and olives. Among these communities lived the Serrano family, modest landholders, respected at first for their resourcefulness and their stubborn refusal to leave the valley even when epidemics and crop failures drove many away. What distinguished the Serranos was not their land, nor their wealth, but their conviction. They believed they carried within their blood a rare gift, an inheritance of intelligence and strength that should not be diluted by strangers. It was whispered that they discouraged their daughters from marrying beyond the valley, arranging instead unions with cousins and distant kin. This pattern, first subtle, hardened into principle by the early 1900s. Generations of Serranos were born into narrow circles of relation. Parish records show repeating surnames, marriages solemnized between second cousins, and infants baptized under the same cluster of godparents. Nothing unusual on its own. Such practices were common in isolated rural Spain, but in the Serranos' case, the practice was pursued with growing deliberation. By 1910, the family line was controlled by three sisters, Dolores, Inés, and Marisol Serrano. Their father had died of fever, their mother of childbirth complications, leaving the daughters to manage the estate. Instead of dispersing through marriage, they bound themselves more tightly together. Parish registers indicate they married the same man, Esteban Reyes, a laborer from a nearby hamlet, whose name was entered 3 times into the church book in rapid succession. No priest in the region could explain how this was permitted, or how the records were allowed to stand, yet they remain today, faded entries written in the same clerical hand, each union sanctified under holy witness. Locals said Esteban was chosen less for love than for obedience. He became the shared husband of the Serrano sisters, bound into their vision of strengthening the bloodline. Children followed, many more than could be easily accounted for. Some parish notes list births that later vanish from census rolls, suggesting infants were either stillborn, hidden, or deliberately unrecorded. Travelers who passed through the valley in the 1920s described the Serrano household as peculiar. A great stone house sat on the edge of a forest clearing, shutters always drawn even in summer. Curtains moved though no one was seen outside. Neighbors recalled pale children, often barefoot, playing silently near the edges of the orchard. They never mingled with others, never attended school or festivals, and vanished indoors at the sound of a bell rung from within. By 1932, Spain was in turmoil. The Second Republic struggled with uprisings, strikes, and violent clashes. Yet in the Serrano compound, life continued according to rules known only to its inhabitants. They harvested, slaughtered, and buried without inviting outsiders. It was during this period that medical officials in nearby towns began noticing irregularities. Children brought for baptism with unusual deformities, rumors of twins born who shared uncanny likenesses, and adolescents whose speech was delayed far beyond normal development. A physician from León, Dr. Rafael Ordóñez, wrote privately in his notebook after examining one Serrano boy. The child is 9 years of age, yet the jaw and skull show disproportionate growth. Teeth are irregular, speech absent, though understanding seems present. Family insists this is normal and refuses further observation. His notes found decades later confirm what many villagers suspected but dared not say aloud. The Serranos' pursuit of purity was breeding weakness, not strength. The Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936. Soldiers marched through the region, seizing barns and conscripting men. For a time the Serranos were spared, their valley too remote to attract sustained military presence. But stories reached journalists covering the conflict. One Scottish correspondent, Thomas Mackinnon, heard whispers of a family living in deliberate seclusion, practicing rituals of union that defied both law and church. Mackinnon's later notes describe his trek to the valley in 1938. He expected little more than a curiosity, a footnote in the chaos of war. What he found unsettled him for the rest of his career. The Serrano sisters, now middle-aged, received him politely at first. Esteban was absent, or perhaps deceased. Accounts conflict. Mackinnon observed children of varying ages, all with similar pale eyes, thin frames and strangely synchronized mannerisms. He noted how they avoided his gaze, how they clustered together in silence as if rehearsed. Most haunting was the sense of order. The Serranos were not chaotic, not mad in the obvious sense. They moved with precision, as though following rules carved deep into habit. When Mackinnon asked about schooling, they replied the valley itself was their teacher. When he inquired about the children's father, the sisters smiled but offered no answer. His dispatches would later be suppressed, filed under unverified, as Spain's war consumed larger headlines. Yet his private journals record a chilling observation. They believe utterly in their project. To them this is not perversion but progress, a family purified through itself, the valley their laboratory, the house their ark. What Mackinnon glimpsed in 1938 was the threshold of a story that would echo for decades, the collapse of a lineage in the name of perfection, and the ruin of all bound within its walls. Every village has its haunted place. Sometimes it is a ruined abbey, sometimes a burned mill. In Asturias, it was the Serrano house, though it stood intact, stone walls firm, roof tight against the rain. What haunted it was not ghosts, but the living. The war years deepened the Serrano family's isolation. While men across Spain were conscripted into Franco's army, or drawn into Republican militias, the Serrano compound remained untouched. Its remoteness sheltered it from patrols and reprisals, and its reputation, whispered warnings about curses and children with twisted limbs, discouraged soldiers from entering the valley. By 1939, as Franco declared victory, the sisters remained firmly entrenched in their stone estate. Local villagers told of seeing smoke rise from the Serrano chimneys long after other households had fled famine. Somehow, the sisters had preserved stores of grain, meat and oil. Some suggested Esteban, if he still lived, had bartered with soldiers, trading livestock or favors to keep the family safe. Others insisted the Serranos needed no outside trade, that everything they required came from within their walls. It was during these years that rumors sharpened into something darker. Whispers in the village. An old shepherd named Mateo claimed he had once stumbled into the Serrano orchard after dusk. He described rows of trees heavy with fruit, but guarded by silent figures who emerged from the shadows. Children, he said, but not like ours. They watched me with eyes that did not blink, and when the bell rang from the house, they all turned together, as one body, and walked away. Another villager, a woman named Isidora, swore she saw a child's hand reach from a second-story window, thin and bone-white, grasping for air before being pulled suddenly back inside. She never passed the house again. The parish priest, Father Enrique, attempted several visits, urging the sisters to bring their children to Mass. He returned unsettled, muttering about a household that believes itself more holy than the Church. Soon after, he ceased his efforts. Mackinnon's return in 1941. Journalist Thomas Mackinnon returned to Spain, this time under stricter censorship as Franco consolidated power. Still, his fascination with the Serranos lingered. Against his editor's advice, he made a second journey to the valley. His journals describe a house unchanged yet more secretive. The sisters, now in their 50s, greeted him coldly. Their husband Esteban was not mentioned at all. Children still roamed, more numerous than before, though their ages were difficult to judge. Some looked small for their years, others prematurely aged, with hollow cheeks and weary eyes. Mackinnon wrote, "They are born alike, and grow alike. It is as if individuality itself is being bred out of them. They speak little, but when they do, the words are shared. One begins, another finishes, voices overlapping like echoes." He was not invited to stay the night. Before leaving, he noticed a locked door at the rear of the compound. From behind it, he claimed to hear faint cries, not weeping exactly, but strained moans, like the sounds of livestock penned too tightly. When he asked about it, Dolores, the eldest sister, told him firmly, "That is not for you." The Hidden Generations archival research decades later, after some of the Serrano papers were released to medical investigators, confirmed what neighbors suspected. The sisters had created a cycle of intermarriage, not only with their shared husband, but eventually with their own offspring. By the late 1940s, some Serrano children were fathering children with cousins, even half-siblings. Geneticists reviewing the case in the 1970s identified signs of inbreeding depression, congenital deformities, cognitive impairments, and high infant mortality. Out of more than 30 recorded births between 1912 and 1950, fewer than half survived into adulthood. Of those, most displayed significant developmental delays, but to the Serrano sisters, these losses did not prove failure. Instead, they reinforced their belief that the weak must be sacrificed so the strong could emerge. They spoke, in rare interviews decades later, of weeding the garden and preserving the true line. The war after the war in post-war Spain, hunger and repression shadowed the land, yet the Serranos remained curiously untouched. Franco's officials seemed aware of the family, but uninterested in disturbing them. Some historians suggest the Serranos may have provided covert assistance to local phalangists during the conflict, buying silence with loyalty. Others argue the regime simply preferred not to confront a family whose practices, though abhorrent, mirrored in miniature the fascist obsession with purity and strength. By the mid-1950s, however, the Serranos could no longer hide the consequences of their closed circle. Travelers reported sighting skeletal children digging in the soil, their bodies twisted by scoliosis and rickets. At night, strange chanting was heard from the house, rhythmic voices rising and falling together, as though rehearsed in ritual. A young nurse, Maria Domenech, attempted to visit the Serranos in 1956, after hearing rumors of illness. She later testified, in private interviews, that she was turned away at the door. But before leaving, she glimpsed a young girl inside, perhaps 12 years old, whose face bore such resemblance to the sisters that Maria described her as a mirror of three women at once. The locked room, perhaps the most chilling detail, came from a hunter who trespassed onto the estate in 1958. Pursuing a wounded boar, he approached the back of the house and saw through a narrow opening in the shutters a room lit by lanterns. Inside, he swore he saw beds, iron frames arranged in rows, each occupied by thin figures lying motionless. Some turned their heads toward him, eyes wide, mouths opening soundlessly. He fled, abandoning his kill. Days later, when he told others, no one doubted him. They only warned him never to return. McKinnon's breaking point. Thomas McKinnon, nearing the end of his career, made one final attempt in 1961 to expose the Serranos. His report, unpublished during his lifetime, describes his horror at what he found. The children are no longer children. They are generations stacked upon generations. Some crawl though they are grown, others speak though their bodies are still infantile. Yet the sisters regard them with pride, as though every misshapen limb, every vacant stare is a victory. I fear this valley is less a home than an experiment, and the experiment has no end. This was the moment McKinnon abandoned any faith in human progress. To his colleagues, he later confessed, "I went looking for history. I found hell instead." A house can rot from the inside long before the roof caves in. For the Serranos, the cracks began not in the stone, but in the blood. The unraveling. By the 1960s, Spain was transforming. Tourists flocked to the coasts, factories spread across Madrid and Barcelona, and even Franco's dictatorship loosened enough to allow controlled modernization. Yet in Asturias, the Serrano house remained frozen in another century, as if time itself refused to cross its threshold. But behind its walls, the family was breaking down. The sisters, once united in purpose, began to argue. Dolores, the eldest, insisted on preserving the strict rules: no marriages outside the family, no children raised with outsiders, the line kept pure. Lucia, increasingly frail, begged for an end. Esperanza, sharp-eyed and cold, sided with Dolores. The next generation, the children and grandchildren,
bore the weight of this division. Many were too sickly to work the land, and those who could were often unfit for marriage. Neighbors told of Serrano youths who wandered into the village square, staring blankly at shop windows, unable to speak beyond a few broken words. Government attention. The turning point came in 1968, when a provincial health officer was sent to investigate reports of abnormal births and unschooled children in the valley. His notes, declassified in 1999, describe a scene of horror. I found within the Serrano estate 27 individuals under the age of 30. Of these, perhaps a third displayed severe deformities, spines twisted, faces asymmetrical, limbs shortened or missing. Others showed signs of profound mental disability. They were housed not in separate rooms but together, on iron cots under the watch of the elder sisters. Food was sparse, hygiene poor. I am convinced this is a generational product of consanguinity at its most extreme. The report was quietly buried. Franco's officials had no desire to publicize a story that would shame the image of a strong and united Spain. Instead, they recommended containment. The Serranos were left to themselves, with the tacit understanding that their children would not be permitted to leave the valley. Death of Esteban in 1970. Esteban Serrano, the elusive husband who had fathered the first generations, was declared dead at 74. No priest was called for the burial. No grave marker was placed in the family plot. Some villagers whispered he had died long before, his name kept alive by the sisters as a convenient fiction. Others believed his death, real or long hidden, marked the moment the family began to truly collapse. With Esteban gone, the children he had fathered were now producing children of their own. The bloodlines, already tangled, grew even more unstable. Infant deaths multiplied. Survivors grew up gaunt, coughing, their eyes glassy. The house filled with silence, broken only by the mutterings of prayers Dolores forced upon them.
The 1973 fire. A major fire struck the Serrano property in the winter of 1973. Officially, it began when a lantern overturned in one of the storage rooms, but villagers swore they saw flames rise first from the second floor, from the wing that had always been locked. Fire brigades arrived too late. Several children perished, trapped in their beds. Survivors were seen huddled in the courtyard, their faces smeared with soot, staring at the flames without screaming, without crying. They looked relieved, said one witness. Afterward, the burned wing was bricked up. From that year on, the Serrano compound was spoken of less as a home and more as a mausoleum. McKinnon's last visit. Thomas McKinnon, old and unwell, made his final journey in 1975, the year Franco himself lay dying. He arrived to find Dolores bedridden, Lucia nearly blind, and Esperanza, the youngest sister, presiding over the household with iron will. McKinnon recorded, "The house reeks of smoke and decay. The younger Serranos drift like phantoms, their bodies broken, their eyes empty. One girl carries a child who is not yet 2, though the child looks already half dead. They show it to me with pride as though still convinced of their mission. Dolores mutters about sacrifice, Lucia about forgiveness, but Esperanza speaks of triumph. She says, 'What we have made will outlast the world.'" It was too much. McKinnon returned to Britain, resigned his post, and never wrote publicly of the Serranos again. In his private notes he confessed, "I once thought of them as misguided. Now I think of them as monstrous." He died 3 years later, haunted by visions of the house. The passing of the sisters. Lucia died in 1976, her funeral conducted in secret. Dolores followed in 1979, her body reportedly interred in the family crypt beneath the house. By then only Esperanza remained. Esperanza was different. She had no interest in surrender or remorse. Under her rule, the Serranos became even more closed off. Gates were locked, curtains nailed shut. Villagers claimed the house fell silent at night. No more chants, no more music, just stillness. Some thought everyone inside had died, leaving Esperanza to wander alone among corpses. But every so often in the 1980s, children's shadows were glimpsed in the orchard. bent figures, running strangely, vanishing at the sound of footsteps. Proof, perhaps, that the Serrano line continued, even if it was little more than a curse carried forward. Civilizations forget, but the earth remembers. The Serrano house stood until the end, a monument not to progress, but to delusion. The 1980s silence. By the early 1980s, the Serrano estate was almost entirely cut off from the outside world. Letters had stopped. Supplies once delivered by mule from the village no longer arrived. The orchard, long overgrown, swallowed the path that once led to the iron gate. For most locals, the family had become a ghost story, a warning told to children. Don't wander near the Serranos, they will take you inside and you'll never return. Yet Esperanza was still alive. At 89, she remained the final guardian of the family's ideology. Unlike her sisters, she did not show signs of regret. In interviews conducted years later with surviving villagers, Esperanza was remembered as stern, proud, even regal. She carried herself as though her family's collapse were not tragedy but martyrdom. Proof that they had sacrificed more for human perfection than anyone else dared. Inside the house, conditions had worse. Survivors of the next generation lived in dim corridors, many unable to read, some unable even to speak. Most suffered chronic illness. Neighbors recalled hearing coughs, echoing at night, traveling across the valley like the cries of dying animals. The researchers, in 1981, after Franco's death and the political shift to democracy, Spain quietly declassified a number of health files, including the Serrano dossier. A small group of medical researchers from Madrid requested access to the family. To everyone's surprise, Esperanza agreed. She met them in the orchard, seated on a wooden chair, her black dress immaculate, her hair tied in a neat bun. Behind her, half a dozen pale children watched silently, their eyes downcast. One researcher described the scene. She welcomed us as if we were guests at a royal court. She spoke of genetics, of progress, of sacrifice. She insisted we refer to her family not as victims, but as pioneers. All the while the children lingered like shadows, their bodies deformed, their minds clouded. We left shaken. Yet she seemed entirely untouched by reality. The researchers published nothing beyond a confidential report. To expose the Serranos publicly would have meant scandal, not only for the family, but for the government that had ignored them for decades. Death of Esperanza. In 1983, Esperanza Serrano died in a nursing home in Madrid, where she had been transferred after collapsing in the orchard. She was 96. Her death marked the end of direct memory. No other elder Serranos remained to tell the story. What was left were the children, many now adults, but most unable to function independently. Some were placed in care facilities under assumed names. Others simply vanished into the bureaucracy of Spain's welfare system. A few, it is said, never left the compound, choosing to remain in the ruins of their ancestral home, until it crumbled. The legacy. After Esperanza's passing, the Serrano estate was seized by the state. Officially, it was condemned for safety reasons and bulldozed in, yet locals swear the demolition was incomplete. They claim the house was only partly destroyed, its crypt sealed, its foundations left intact under the earth. For years afterward, hikers reported stumbling upon fragments: a rusted cot, a scorched wall, a child's shoe buried in the orchard soil. The land grew wild again, covering the scars. By the 1990s, the valley appeared untouched, as though nothing had ever stood there. But the whispers persisted. Academics began to study the Serrano case in earnest. Their story became a reference point in discussions of social isolation, genetic counseling, and the psychology of closed groups. It was cited in medical journals, ethics debates, and even criminology courses. The sisters' vision of perfection had achieved nothing but misery, yet it remained a powerful warning of how ideology can twist ordinary people into architects of cruelty. McKinnon's reflection. Thomas McKinnon, though long dead by this time, had left his personal reflections in sealed archives. When opened in 1990, they revealed his true feelings. The Serranos believed themselves exceptional, chosen, purified. But what I saw was the opposite of perfection. A family reduced to ash by its own fire. They were neither saints nor scientists. They were dreamers without conscience, and dreamers without conscience are the most dangerous of all. His words echoed the thoughts of many who later studied the case. The Serranos were not demons, not monsters from folklore. They were human beings, convinced that their suffering had meaning, and that belief, more than the inbreeding, more than the cruelty, was what kept the system alive for decades. The Cursed Valley. Today the Valley of Asterius remains sparsely populated. Farmers avoid the land where the Serrano house once. They call it La Tierra Maldita, the cursed earth. Those who do pass through speak of unease, as though watched. Some claim to hear whispers, others the faint sound of children coughing in the night. The government has never acknowledged the case publicly. Records remain sealed under laws of family privacy and state security. Journalists who attempt to investigate often find themselves facing locked archives and bureaucratic silence. Still, the Serrano legacy lingers. It exists, not only in academic papers and whispered tales, but in the soil itself, where generations lived and died believing they were building something greater than themselves. Final reflection. The story of the Serrano sisters is not one of supernatural horror. No ghosts walked their halls. No curses carved their names. Instead, it is a reminder that the true monsters of history are ordinary people who convince themselves their cruelty serves a higher cause. The Serranos dreamed of genetic perfection, but what they left behind was only suffering, deformity and silence. Their house is gone, but the questions remain. How many other families, hidden in valleys or behind closed doors, pursue visions just as dark? How many stories like theirs lie buried, waiting to be uncovered? Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the Serranos were not unique. They were a mirror, showing us what happens when isolation, obsession, and ideology drown out compassion. And mirrors, unlike myths, never lie. It is not rumor that damns the Serranos, but the papers they left behind. The hidden archive. When the Serrano estate was seized in the mid-1980s, workers discovered not only ruined furniture and human remains, but also boxes of papers stacked in the cellar. Some were wrapped in oilcloth, others bound in leather. Many were water damaged, but a surprising number had survived intact. Inside were ledgers, anatomical sketches, midwife reports, and dozens of personal journals. For years they sat in storage, unexamined, until in 1991 the Ministry of Health quietly authorized a team of archivists to catalog them. What they found was more disturbing than any folk tale. The journals of Esperanza, Serrano. Esperanza, the last sister, had kept meticulous notes from the 1940s until the 1970s, written in tight script. Her diaries read less like confessionals and more like laboratory records. She listed the names of children, their physical traits, their failures, and in some cases the date of their disposal. One entry from 1954 reads, "Male, born of Marisol's daughter, third finger fused, breath shallow, prognosis, weak, removed from register, mother inconsolable." I reminded her, sentiment is weakness. She will learn. There is no indication what removed from register meant. Researchers assumed it referred to neglect or quiet burial, yet several bones later recovered from the orchard matched the ages Esperanza recorded. Another entry, 1961, "The blood grows thicker, but also truer. Weakness accumulates. Yes, but there is refinement in form. The girls especially bear resemblance to our mother, though their minds do not follow. It is a price we must accept. Perfection demands sacrifice." Anatomical sketches. Alongside the journals were crude sketches, mostly in Esperanza's hand, some attributed to their shared husband, Alejandro. They depicted malformed limbs, extra digits, cleft palates, and skeletal deformity. The drawings were labeled with dates, initials and remarks in the margins. Viable, retained, discarded. Medical experts reviewing them noted that the Serranos had developed their own shorthand for describing hereditary defect. It resembled neither proper medical terminology nor folk superstition, but a hybrid system born of desperation and obsession. The ledger of births, the most shocking discovery, was a long ledger, covering the years 1938. It listed 67 births. Of these, only 19 had names. The rest were marked with symbols, circles, crosses, or blank spaces. 1 page. 1942. ES female, stillborn cross. CS male, alive circle. MS female, viable, retained. By comparing the ledger with oral histories from villagers, researchers confirmed that far more children had been born than anyone suspected. Many never appeared outside the house. Their lives began and ended inside those walls, reduced to symbols in a book. McKinnon's testimony, though his formal report from the 1950s had been sanitized, McKinnon's private notes, uncovered decades later in Scotland, offered blunt descriptions. The Serrano family approaches reproduction as a craft. They select unions. They study outcomes. They speak in generations. I believe they do not see their children as children, but as iterations of a single experiment. What troubles me most is not their ignorance, but their clarity. They know the harm. They simply do not care. The medical consensus. By 1993, geneticists, reviewing the Serrano papers, concluded that the family had experienced a textbook case of consanguinity collapse. With each generation, genetic defects compounded, leading to sterility, deformity, and cognitive decline. But there was also a psychological dimension. Notes revealed a rigid belief that suffering purified the bloodline. The sisters often referred to their offspring as offerings. This was not accidental breeding. It was deliberate ritual framed as silence from the state. Despite the grim revelations, Spain's Ministry of Health never released the Serrano documents to the public. The official reason was family privacy. Unofficially, scholars believed the state feared international scrutiny for allowing such a family to exist unmonitored for so long. A handful of photocopies circulated underground. Anthropologists and students of medical ethics whispered about them in conferences. They compared the Serranos to infamous cases in rural America and Central Europe, but noted one difference. The Serranos had documented themselves. They had preserved their own crimes, convinced they were preserving triumph. The most disturbing fragment among the papers was a final, undated scrap in Esperanza's handwriting. When the last child is born, the line will end, not by failure, but by fulfillment. We have carried the burden of humanity's impurity, and we have burned it from within. What comes after us is silence, and silence is purity. Some scholars argued this proved Esperanza understood extinction was inevitable. Others suggested it was not resignation, but pride, that she saw the end as success. Aftermath. The Serrano archive remains locked in Madrid, accessible only to a few researchers under special permission, yet fragments leak, copied and recopied, fueling rumors. Every few years, new photographs surface online. A child with a twisted spine, a ledger page marked in Esperanza's hand. Each leak revives the horror. Each leak deepens the legend. The truth is both simpler and worse than the folklore. The Serranos were not supernatural, not cursed by God. They were human beings who turned their home into a laboratory, their children into specimens, and their grief into ritual. And for nearly 50 years, they wrote everything down. The body remembers, the blood records. The Serranos wrote their scripture in flesh. Foreign interest. By the mid-1950s, word of the Serrano children reached beyond Spain. Quiet reports circulated in academic circles, passed between anthropologists, physicians, and clergy. Many dismissed them as exaggeration. Tales of inbred families were common in rural Europe, and often turned out to be slander or superstition. But the Serranos were different. They had records, drawings, and most importantly, living examples. In 1957, a team from Leon traveled to Castilla,
Under the guise of studying rural poverty, privately, they sought permission to examine 3 of the surviving Serrano children. The sisters agreed, not out of shame, but with the pride of breeders, showing a prize stock. Observations. The French physicians described the children as lucid, yet limited. One boy, aged 14, could recite Catholic prayers perfectly, but did not know his own name. A girl of 12 sang entire folk songs, but her spine was so curved, she could not stand without assistance. Measurements were taken: skull circumference, limb proportions, dental irregularities. Photographs were quietly developed in a Madrid hotel. Notes were dispatched to Paris under seal. The physician's conclusion: a cluster of recessive pathologies, consistent with prolonged endogamy, a unique opportunity for longitudinal study. The Serrano philosophy. Esperanza welcomed such intrusions. Her diaries reveal she believed external validation proved the family's importance. She often referred to her offspring as living manuscripts. In one entry from 1959 she wrote, "They measure the children like cattle, but they do not see what we see. The deformity is not shame, but refinement. We are narrowing the vessel, we are distilling." This phrasing, narrowing, distilling, recurs throughout the journals. Scholars later compared it to the language of eugenics, though inverted. Instead of eliminating defects, the Serranos embraced them as signs of selection.
The McKinnon Addendum. Dr. Robert McKinnon, the Scottish physician who first encountered the family, revisited them in his second set of notes, found only after his death, are more candid than his earlier reports. There is no randomness here. They are not stumbling in darkness. They are charting heredity with the diligence of monks illuminating scripture. Yet what they preserve is rot. Every generation thickens the poison, and still they record, as though they will one day present their findings to God himself. He described infants laid out for inspection, each defect catalogued with calm precision. He noted the family's strange silence during these examinations. No cries, no prayers, only the scratch of pen on paper. Ritualized medicine. By the late 1960s, the Serranos' medical practices had hardened into ritual. Pregnant daughters were confined early, kept on sparse diets to reduce contamination. Births were attended not only by midwives, but by the sisters themselves, who carried notebooks and sketch pads. Blood was collected in small jars, labeled with initials, and stored in the root cellar. No reason was ever given. Some believed Esperanza thought it would preserve the line. Others suggested it was symbolic, proof of ownership over every drop of Serrano blood ever spilled. When outsiders asked about this practice, she dismissed them. "We keep what is ours." Decline of the line. Despite their efforts, the family's vitality collapsed. The birth ledger shows a steep decline after 1965. Surviving children were fewer, defects more severe. Several were described as unresponsive, without voice, or simply void. One especially disturbing entry, 1968. Stillborn female, no eyes, retained for study, buried 3 days later in orchard pit. Researchers reviewing these notes decades later remarked on the clinical detachment. To the Serranos, each death was not tragedy but data. Silence from authorities. Neighbors whispered, priests hinted, but officials did nothing. Franco's Spain was not eager to advertise deformity and incest within its borders. To intervene would be to acknowledge. Silence was easier. So the family continued, decade after decade, their home decayed around them, but the ledgers remained neat, the jars labeled, the sketches meticulous. Foreign curiosity fades. By the 1970s, outside scholars lost interest. Genetics had advanced. Controlled laboratory studies made fieldwork among the Serranos seem grotesque rather than useful. Only a handful of anthropologists still visited, treating the family as living relics of a vanished order. One Spanish researcher, writing anonymously in 1974, offered the bleakest assessment. They are archivists of their own ruin. They write not to enlighten but to endure. When they are gone, their papers will remain a scripture of decay. The philosophy hardens. Esperanza's later entries grow increasingly detached from reality. She began to speak of completion, of an end point to the bloodline. 1971. The vessel is nearly purified. The next generation will be the last. In them, weakness and strength converge. What is born then will close the circle. This obsession with closure echoes throughout her final notebooks. It is as though she no longer believed survival mattered. What mattered was finishing the record. The whisper of completion. In 1974, the ledger abruptly stops. No births recorded. No notes. Just a final page with a single word written across it. Fulfilled. What followed is uncertain. Some say the last children died in infancy. Others believe the remaining daughters were sterile. All that is known is that by 1978, the Serrano house was nearly silent. Villagers reported no smoke from the chimney, no cries from the orchard, only Esperanza's thin figure moving past broken shutters. She lived alone, childless, surrounded by ledgers filled with the echoes of generations. The clinical horror, the true horror, of the Serranos is not gore or violence, but bureaucracy. They treated bloodlines as equations, children as entries, suffering as date. What outsiders saw as deformity, they saw as refinement, and in the end, they left not only bones in the orchard, but pages upon pages of measurements, sketches, and claims of completion, as if their extinction were not failure, but the crowning achievement of a long experiment. At the end, the loudest voice was the paper. The family spoke less and less, and the ledgers spoke more and more. The vanishing line. By 1978, the Serrano home no longer echoed with children's cries. The last births had been failures, infants stillborn, or born so malformed they lived only hours. The surviving daughters aged into sterility, their bodies warped from years of confinement and poor diet. Visitors noted the uncanny hush that settled over the house. Once filled with the shuffle of small feet, it now resounded only with Esperanza's pen scratching across paper, cataloguing what little remained. Neighbors whispered of nights without lamplight, of windows left open to the cold, of a garden left to weed. Yet still, every Sunday Esperanza appeared in church, veil drawn, ledger clutched beneath her arm like a holy book. The orchard. Behind the house stood an orchard, planted by Esperanza's father, olive, fig and quince. By the late 1970s the trees were overgrown, branches heavy with fruit that rotted before anyone harvested it. It was here that the villagers began to suspect burials. Small mounds disturbed the soil between tree roots. Stray dogs unearthed fragments, cloth, tiny bone. The priest asked Esperanza directly, but she did not answer. She simply smiled and said, "We plant what belongs to us." When pressed, she reminded him of her family's donations to the parish. He never asked again. The last visitors. In 1979, 2 German anthropologists did one final study. They were admitted only briefly. Their published notes describe a house nearly bare of furniture, rooms littered with stacked journals and jars, and Esperanza herself gaunt, with hands ink-stained to the wrist. One anthropologist, Dr. Keller, wrote privately in her diary, "The children are gone, only the mother remains, and she treats us like auditors of her great account. She shows us pages filled with diagrams, circles within circles, as though she is mapping the very end of her life. I fear she has been waiting for this moment, to see extinction as triumph." They were not allowed to return. Ritual without audience. After the deaths of her children, Esperanza turned increasingly to ritual, but with no daughters to confine, no infants to measure. The rituals became performance for an empty house. She filled pages with self-observations, blood pressure, weight, pulse. She sketched her own hands as they trembled. She wrote prayers in ink, and then copied them again in blood, pricking her fingers nightly. Neighbors reported hearing her voice carrying across the orchard at dusk, long drawn-out chants that mixed Catholic prayers with strange genealogical litanies, reciting the names of her sisters, her children, her husband, until her voice broke into cough. The collapse. By 1980, the Serrano estate was half ruined. Tiles slipped from the roof, rainwater pooled in the cellar. The orchard grew wilder, roots cracking the foundation of the barn. One villager described passing by and seeing Esperanza kneeling in the mud, pressing a jar of blood into the earth at the base of a fig tree. Her notebooks from this time grow increasingly fragmented, pages filled with single words: fulfilled, complete, circle, return. The handwriting grows erratic, the ink darker, sometimes smeared as though tears had mixed with it. The orchard of silence. It is from this period that the phrase "the orchard of silence" emerges. A school teacher in the nearby village coined it after walking past the Serrano estate one autumn morning. The trees stood heavy with rotting fruit, the air thick with flies, and not a single bird sang. He wrote in his journal, "It was as if even nature held its breath." The orchard devoured sound. I understood then why no child played near the Serrano land. The silence was a warning. Esperanza's final act. On January 12, 1981, Esperanza failed to appear at church for the first time in 40 years. The priest sent 2 men to check on her. They found the front door unlocked, the house reeking of mildew. Esperanza lay in her bed, ledger open beside her. She was not yet dead, but too weak to rise. She refused food, asking only that the ledger remain at her side. She lingered 3 days. On the final morning, she whispered to the priest, "It is complete. Do not disturb the orchard." Then she died. Aftermath. Authorities catalogued the house. They found nearly 60 ledgers, spanning more than a century, each filled with notes on births, deaths, defects, ritual. Jars of blood lined the cellar shelves, some shattered by damp. The orchard was never officially excavated. Villagers knew what lay beneath, but no one demanded it. The church quietly arranged for Esperanza's burial, though few attended. Her ledgers were transferred to the provincial archives, sealed under restriction. Scholars who petitioned for access described them as more disturbing than instructive, less scientific record than testament to obsession. Legacy. With Esperanza's death, the Serrano line ended. No daughters, no heirs, only a ruin filled with paper and silence. Yet in Castilla, the story persists. Locals still call the old grove El Huerto del Silencio, the orchard of silence. They warn children not to play there, saying the ground still breathes when the wind passes through, as though the trees remember the buried generations. Some claim to have found pages carried by storms, brittle scraps of ledger paper, words smudged, diagrams half legible, always the same motifs, circles, names, measurements, the endless attempt to enclose blood within ink. The closing note: what remains of the Serranos is not flesh, but archive. Their lives were consumed by record keeping, their deaths catalogued in their own hand. As one historian concluded in 1992, they wrote themselves into extinction, and in that silence, they found their scripture. It is not enough to die. Some families must be studied, misread, and repeated until their bones have no meaning left. The auction. In 1982, the Serrano estate was opened for public auction. The structure had decayed beyond repair, walls collapsing inward, roof sagging, cellar flooded. Most of the villagers refused to enter. Only outsiders came. Collectors from Madrid and Seville, scholars from Salamanca, even a priest from Lisbon arrived, each hoping to secure fragments of the Serrano archive. The auctioneer, uneasy, handled the items with glove. The lot included household furniture, rusted farm tools, but the prize was the ledgers, 60 volumes, thick with age, wrapped in linen bands. They fetched a high price, purchased not by a university but by a private buyer who insisted on anonymity. To this day their location is uncertain. Only 3 volumes remain in provincial archives, the rest vanishing into private hands. The villagers' refusal, while outsiders picked through the ruins. The villagers kept their distance. Children were told not to cross the threshold. Farmers avoided passing the orchard after dusk. When asked why, they said only, "She told us not to disturb the orchard." A small group of men, perhaps out of fear or reverence, repaired the crumbling wall around the trees. In closing them again, they left a wooden cross at the gate, but no blessing was spoken. Rumors in academia. By 1985, the Serrano story began circulating in academic journals. Anthropologists debated whether Esperanza's records were evidence of ritualistic obsession, or a failed attempt at self-directed science. Medical historians wondered if she had understood the consequences of intermarriage, or if she had simply embraced them. A German scholar wrote, "It is as if the family attempted to outpace biology by cataloging it, believing record-keeping could alter the flesh itself." They mistook writing for remedy, but others dismissed the case as folklore, arguing that most of the records had disappeared conveniently, and that the orchard tales were nothing more than village gossip. Still, a whisper persisted, the idea that Esperanza had achieved something beyond science, that her obsessive recording was not madness, but method. The return of the ledgers. In 1987,
One ledger research. It was mailed anonymously to the university at Salamanca, wrapped in oilcloth, postmarked from Lisbon. Inside, entries from 1969. One page described the burial of an infant in the orchard, its ribcage sketched in Esperanza's fragile hand. Alongside the ledger was a note, unsigned. "This is not the end. Others remain." She wished them dispersed. The university stored it under restricted access. Scholars who viewed it reported nausea, recurring dreams, a sense of text that watches. One archivist resigned after claiming she heard children laughing whenever she opened the volume. The orchard's visitors. Despite warnings, the orchard attracted outsiders. In 1990, a French folklorist visited, hoping to collect local legends. He camped nearby, sketching the twisted trees, noting the eerie absence of birds. He vanished after 3 days. His belongings were found neatly stacked against the orchard wall. His journal contained only one final line: "The soil breathes." The villagers refused to search. Police conducted a cursory investigation, but found nothing. The case remains unsolved. The priest's confession. In 1993, the aging parish priest gave a recorded interview. He admitted that during Esperanza's final days, she had whispered not only of completion, but of preservation. "She told me, 'Father, they are not gone. They are beneath the trees. They listen when I write.' I promised her I would keep the orchard untouched. I did not believe her, and yet I have never walked there since." When pressed, he wept, repeating, "The orchard must not be disturbed." A new folklore. By the late 1990s, the Serrano story had entered Spanish folklore. Ghost stories spread, travelers hearing children's cries from the orchard, lovers daring one another to step inside, school children chanting Esperanza's name in game. In villages, the phrase, "La escritura de sangre," the writing of blood, became shorthand for obsessive documentation. For a family so consumed by record-keeping they wrote themselves out of existence. Some claimed that scraps of ledger paper still appeared after storms, carried into fields and streets, words half erased, as though the orchard continued to copy itself into the world. The historian's warning. In 2001, a Spanish historian published a book on hereditary rituals in rural Europe. He dedicated a chapter to the Serranos. His conclusion: their silence was not mere collapse. It was a design to end a family line deliberately, to bury it beneath trees that refused to yield. This is no accident. It is a scripture of extinction. The book was controversial. Critics accused him of romanticizing atrocity, but the story gained new life, retold in newspapers, documentaries, whispered in lecture halls. The spreading silence. By the early 2000s, the estate was gone. The house had collapsed entirely, its stones carted away for road repair. Only the orchard remained, a fenced grove of gnarled trees, their fruits still falling, rotting, feeding the soil. Villagers say the silence deepened. No insects buzz, no birds perch. Even in spring, the air hangs still. Those who enter report muffled hearing, as though the orchard swallows sound.
One local man who dared to cut branches claimed his ears rang for weeks afterward, as if the trees had screamed. He left the village soon after, so the Serrano name faded from records, yet endured in whispers, in missing scholars, in storm-scattered pages. The family's end became its beginning, no longer blood but story, and always the orchard remained, sealed in silence, fruit rotting, soil restless. Extinction is not absence, it is arrangement. To end oneself in a pattern is to live forever in the space where others must look. The last heir, the Serrano bloodline, officially ended in 1975, but rumors persisted of a surviving heir. Some claimed Esperanza had hidden a child, born to a niece, and raised in secrecy. In 2003, a journalist from Barcelona pursued this theory. He traced obscure baptismal records, unearthing the name of a girl allegedly born in 1962. Her trail ended in Valencia. The journalist never published his findings. He died suddenly in his sleep, aged 43. His notes, found by his widow, contained sketches of the orchard and repeated fragments of the same sentence: "The trees are listening." The archive that writes back. By 2005, digital scans of the 3 known ledgers had been uploaded by scholars. Within weeks, reports emerged of corrupted files, text shifted, pages rearranged, letters duplicating across screens. One archivist insisted the scanned pages contained words not visible in the originals. Another claimed that lines began forming in languages Esperanza could not have known, fragments of Basque, Portuguese, even Latin invocations. The digital archive was quietly taken offline. The orchard's watchers, travelers who attempted to film the orchard in the 2000s, reported strange phenomena. Cameras malfunctioned, batteries drained. Footage, when recovered, showed distortion, shadows that moved against the angle of light, branches that bent toward the lens. In one surviving video, a man can be heard whispering, "Do you hear them? They're under the roots." The man who filmed it later refused to speak about the trip, saying only that he would never step near a fruit tree again. The soil test. In 2010, a group of scientists from Madrid obtained permission to conduct soil tests at the site. They reported abnormally high nitrogen content, far beyond typical decomposition. More troubling, they found traces of calcium phosphate, consistent with large amounts of buried bone. When pressed, the team admitted the concentration suggested not just one body but dozens. The findings were sealed, officially citing laboratory error. The lead researcher resigned the following year. The villagers' protest. The discovery reignited tension in the village. Locals began gathering at the orchard wall, not in prayer but in silence. Some brought offerings of bread or wine, leaving them untouched at the gate. One elderly woman told an interviewer, "We are feeding them as they fed us." Another said, "The Serranos are not gone. They are waiting for us to forget them. We will not." By 2012, villagers had placed a permanent padlock on the orchard gate, forbidding entry even to scholars. They called it an acto de respeto, an act of respect. The pregnant woman. In 2013, a young couple from Madrid trespassed into the orchard at night. They recorded their visit on a handheld camera, laughing, mocking the stories. The woman was pregnant. Weeks later, she miscarried. The footage, later leaked, shows her sitting beneath a tree, growing suddenly quiet, saying, "It's moving too much." Her partner insists she was only frightened by the atmosphere. But in the audio beneath her voice, there is a second, faint sound, like a child crying underground. The growing silence. Between 2015 and 2018, multiple reports surfaced of silence expanding beyond the orchard. Farmers claimed their fields fell still for minutes at a time. Travelers described a pressure in the air, as if sound itself were being swallowed. One man claimed he heard pages turning in the silence, though no book was near. Another said he dreamt of writing names he did not know, waking to find the words scratched into his bedroom wall. The scripture of extinction. In 2019, a Portuguese historian revisited the case, publishing an article titled, "The Serranos, a Scripture of Extinction." He argued that Esperanza's obsessive writing was not a symptom, but a design. The ledgers, the orchard, the silence, they are a system. She ensured her family would vanish biologically, but remain narratively parasitic on all who attempt to interpret them. To speak of the Serranos is to extend them. His article concluded with a chilling line. "They ended their blood, but not their voice. They speak now through us." The children's game. By 2021, school children in nearby towns had adopted a new game. At dusk, they would stand at the orchard wall, press their ears to the wood, and chant, "Esperanza deixa-nos entrar." Esperanza, let us in. Teachers discouraged it. Parents forbade it. Yet the game spread, whispered across provinces, appearing even in urban playgrounds. No one admitted teaching it. The letter. In 2022, the Salamanca archive received a final anonymous package. Inside, a torn page from one of the missing ledgers. The text read, "They are almost ready. The orchard is full. Soon the silence will move outward, and we will no longer need names." The handwriting was Esperanza's, but the paper was dated so the Serrano family, thought ended in 1975, continued to haunt, not only their village, but the very act of history itself. Their silence spread, their orchard fed, their words infected archives and minds alike. And still the unanswered question grew. Was this mere coincidence of folklore and obsession, or had Esperanza Serrano, in her final act, designed something that would outlive not just her family, but sound itself? To forget is mercy, to remember is curse, to speak is to plant again. The Vanishing Archive. By 2023, The Serrano materials in Salamanca had all but vanished. Pages slipped from folders, ink bled into unreadable stains. When questioned, staff admitted they no longer wanted the collection on their shelves. One archivist said, "It copies itself. Even when we lock it away, it finds another surface." The director quietly ordered the Serrano holdings transferred to a sealed chamber. Access was denied. Requests for study were ignored. It was as if the family itself had been reburied, not in the soil of Valencia, but in the silence of forgotten shelves. The orchard today, the orchard still stands. The padlock remains, rusted but intact. Weeds grow high along the wall. Children no longer play there though. Some swear they hear humming when they pass. Satellite images reveal nothing unusual, but locals insist the trees are taller each year, their branches knotted into strange angles. In spring, blossoms emerge, but few survive into fruit. The ones that do are said to fall too early, bruised and hollow, as if drained from the inside. A traveler in 2024 described the orchard as a place that refuses air. He reported dizziness, pressure in the ears, and an overwhelming urge to whisper. The last Serrano. Rumors of a surviving heir refused to die. A woman in Seville claimed she carried Serrano blood. When interviewed, she produced a birth certificate marked with Esperanza's handwriting. Experts dismissed it as forgery, yet she knew details about the orchard that had never been published. Weeks later, her apartment caught fire. The cause was never determined. The name that spreads. Linguists studying oral traditions noted that the name Serrano has become strangely common in children's rhymes across Spain. In some versions, it replaces older names without explanation. One haunting variant, recorded in Granada in 2023, goes, "Serrano, Serrano, silence in the tree. If you speak it once, it will speak through me." No adult admitted teaching. The silence that travels. The strangest reports, however, are not of the orchard, nor the ledgers, nor the villagers. They come from places with no direct connection at all. A man in Mexico City, researching genealogies, dreamed repeatedly of a tree orchard, with 3 women waiting at its center. A teacher in Toronto found the name Esperanza written across her chalkboard, though she had not written it. An archivist in Berlin complained of entire hours missing from her recordings, her microphone capturing nothing but a low rustle, like pages turning. All of them, independently, spoke of the same sensation, a silence that grows. The final theory. Before her death, the Portuguese historian who wrote Scripture of Extinction left an unfinished note. It read, "Esperanza understood that blood is finite, but story is not. She ended her family to make them immortal. Each ledger was not record but seed, each orchard, not burial but broadcast. We have been mistaking pathology for invention. She has written us into her orchard." His papers ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with one word repeated across the page. "Ready," a whispered warning, and so we returned to where we began. A village in Valencia, a family thought extinguished, 3 sisters, and their shared husband, remembered only in fragments, and yet still moving through us. The Serrano story cannot be ended because its ending is what sustains it. Every retelling waters the orchard, every whisper extends its silence. If you doubt this, listen now. Pause. Do you hear it? That small creeping hush between my words, that pressure in your ear, that moment where the room feels heavier, that is theirs. The silence has reached you. Thank you for walking through this history with me. If you've made it this far, remember, do not say their name aloud tonight. Do not write it down again. And whatever you do not dream of the orchard, because if you do, the silence will not leave you.